Welcome to Built for This. I'm your host, Brian Briscoe. My podcast features captivating conversations with intriguing people who have found purpose in their lives through their career, family, or life experiences, and just why they were built for this. Through the stories that you will hear, I trust that you will be inspired and encouraged to find just what you were built for. So let's get started. And thanks again for joining us on this week's episode of Built for This. I've got a really great opportunity to catch up with an old high school and college teammate, classmate. We played a lot of pickup sports together, and, we both had our own career ideas starting out into our life. He wanted to be a sports journalist. I went the broadcasting way, and we're going to find out a little more about that. My guest is my longtime friend, Phil Rogers. Phil, thanks for joining on the show this week.
Oh, Brian, this is my pleasure, believe me.
Now, let's talk a little bit. I'm going to tell people that, you've covered, after we got out of high school in the University of North Texas, and then your journey and a few stops on the newspaper route, led you to cover a lot of different things, but you eventually make your way to Dallas to cover the Texas Rangers, and now for a long time, a lot of people will know you nationally for covering Major League Baseball. But let's go way back. Let's and you've written some books. I do want to talk about that as well, and your career in sports writing. Well, let's go back to the high school in North Texas days. When we were growing up in Denton, Texas, did you kind of know all along that this is what you wanted to do, that you wanted to be a journalist, and in particular a sports writer?
Well, I was blessed, and a lot of us in my generation were blessed because there were three really good newspapers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Growing up in Denton, my parents took them all. So I would read the Dallas Times Herald, the Dallas Morning News, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And I was a big sports consumer it was always kind of the easiest thing for me to do. And Brian, you'll remember, because you were in some of those same classes, we were really lucky that we had tremendous journalism teachers at Denton High School in the late Gary Whistler and Carol Narcissus. And our school paper was vital. And I just kind of discovered early it was easy for me to do. And then luckily, I discovered you could make $20 on a Friday night by going to cover a high school football game. And, it was just something that was kind of in my wheelhouse. And, somewhere along the line, I realized you could make a living doing it and decided to give it a try. And it worked out. And I was, really, really lucky to be able to carve out a nice life doing something I loved.
And, I think we both had those same kind of aspirations, like you said early on, finding something that was fun to do, but you would also make a little money. I remember you going to the local Lewisville, Texas newspaper and covering some high school games on Friday night and writing for the North Texas Daily at our alma mater. But when you get out of college, talk a little bit about your first opportunity. Was it Shreveport? Was that the first stop that you had a newspaper, a real professional opportunity?
That was the first job I took. And I would say when I was in college, I was just looking for work, and I would never say no to work. One time I covered high school track and field meet in the pouring rain. It took like 7 hours. I had no idea what was going on, and having to get the results myself. It was not an easy afternoon, but I just never said no to work. And then after I graduated, I was looking for opportunities, and I interviewed for a job at the Daily Ardmorite in Ardmore, Oklahoma. I interviewed at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal in Lubbock and Shreveport, kind of all at the same time. And Shreveport, not exactly a vacation spot in the early 80s. But I had a tremendous opportunity to cover Friday night. I'd cover high school football. Saturday, I'd cover college football. And Sunday, if I was willing to drive, and I was, I'd either cover the Saints in New Orleans or the Cowboys in Dallas. And it just afforded me a great chance to grow. And really in my 20s. I hated that I couldn't play college or softball with my college buddies, and the things that I was doing before graduation. But I just looked for the opportunities where I could get a chance to do the most challenging work. And,
Mhm.
that led me to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then Jacksonville, Florida, where I was for 3 years before the Times Herald offered me a chance to come back to Dallas.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Well, you mentioned all these sports jobs and assignments because when you went to all these newspapers, you had to start working Friday nights and every other nights and weekends. You weren't able to play in all the leagues, and you and I played in a lot of softball leagues going through college, and those were some good times. But then real life, started to happen for both of us. But talk about how Dallas happened for you. Like you said, you went to Albuquerque, and then you were in Florida at Jacksonville, and then along comes an opportunity to come home to work at newspapers that you grew up reading.
Well, not only is the Dallas Fort Worth area my home, but in the 1980s, the sports journalism that was being practiced was almost second to none in the nation. The papers were so vital, and they
Yeah.
were using the Times Herald versus the Morning News. They were using sort of the sports department as a weekly battleground in the newspaper war there, and very aggressive with their sports coverage. And both papers had so many great writers. It was just a place a guy like me would naturally be drawn to, whether it was home or not. And the fact it was home, that was a huge bonus. But, that was always, while I was going to Albuquerque and working in Jacksonville, getting a chance in the Dallas Fort Worth market was really what I was looking for. And along the way, I interviewed it and contacted sports editors at all three of those papers. And,
Hmm.
I was fortunate that the Dallas Times Herald offered me a chance to come back as sort of a general assignment writer. I actually was covering a lot of North Texas when I came back
Yeah.
in Corky Nelson football era. And it was a blast. And then just sort of in a year's time, kind of worked my way up to a pro beat, and the Texas Rangers was the first one that opened. And I've been watching the Rangers since 1972, so it was a very good fit. And after that, I sort of became a Rangers specialist. But I still treasure the chance I got to write about pretty much all sports, and it was nuts what a guy in his 20s could wind up covering: the NCAA Final Fours, Masters,
Hmm.
golf tournaments. And it was just sort of, I never don't say no to a chance, and challenge yourself. You can probably do it. NASCAR. When I was working in Jacksonville, Florida, I can remember being at the Daytona Speedway, went to the pits to do a story on Richard Petty, walked into his little garage area, and I told him who I was. I asked, if I had this 3 o'clock appointment or whatever it was with Richard, and from under the car, he rolls out and says, "Yeah, I'll be right with you." It was just such a great area to have access to these people that were sort of iconic figures in sports.
Let's talk a little bit more about. When you were at the Times Herald and then the Morning News in the '80s, as you talked about, that was such a great time to be in the newspaper business, and certainly in the Dallas market when you had three really vital newspapers going. And as you mentioned, you covered a lot of different things before getting the pro beat, primarily there with the Rangers. But what was that like? Because when we were all working in the media side, and you still are, we're all friends, but we're all competing for stories. We were certainly at that time. Oh, talk about what that was like when the two Dallas newspapers and the Fort Worth Star Telegram all trying to compete for the same stories, and it was one of the really great markets to be in, as you mentioned, when you have three major newspapers covering sports at the level that they were.
Yeah, it was very aggressive, and it could be you could need some Maalox some mornings, because it was nerve wracking to get up and look at the other papers and see what stories they had and make sure you had the story you needed to have.
Yeah.
This was pre-internet. So
Yeah.
honestly, you had to wait till a newspaper landed on your lawn unless something huge happened. And it was very competitive. I worked in the baseball beat, had great people. The morning news, Tim Kirkjian was the first
Yeah.
person I competed with, and then Tim left. Tracy Ringlesby, Jerry Fraley came to town. Um, all of those three guys have won the top baseball writer award. And Fort Worth had guys that had been doing it for a long time, and Paul Hagan, Jim Reeves,
Yeah.
and it was a fight. But when I look back on it, I'm happy that we were able to compete day to day. And I would say there were periods where one paper might have a breaking story one day. The next 2 days, the other papers might have better, and then the next day, the other one would roll around. I thought it was
Yeah.
great for the readers because it wasn't everybody writing the same story every day. But I'm really happy that we all wound up, on good terms, despite
Mhm.
the stress that you could feel in the moment on the job.
What about the changes that, I mean, you've been doing this a long time, and we're going to get to the work that you've went on to the Chicago Tribune and Major League Baseball.com and all the things that you're doing right now and writing books. But Phil, from the time that, back in the dark ages when you and I at college and trying to learn our crafts, and you come out into the newspaper or sports writing industry at that time, but now this far removed from it, what's the biggest challenges or changes? Obviously, we're digital, but different changes that you see and access to maybe players and people, and from a journalist standpoint, what have you noticed so much?
Yeah, I mean, I would say halfway through a 40-year career, the landscape really changed with the internet. And then shortly after that, the teams started operating their own websites. And with that came trying to control the news a lot more,
Hmm.
controlling the access. Um, I can remember if it wasn't opening day at Arlington Stadium, there would be three beat writers out there day in and day out, and we might be just about the only people there. Maybe a
Yeah.
radio station would come before the game to pick up some tape or after the game. But for 9 innings, we were, pretty much the only people there. And now with blogs and other ways people can get into the business without having to have a full-time salary and have to go through your newspaper to get accreditation. Now the numbers of people working in a professional game has you know grown by a lot. Even as newspapers themselves have shrank. There are a lot of teams where they might have only one beat writer still covering the team for a newspaper. But there are a lot of people out there with their own sites and connected to some national websites. So all of that changed, and I feel really fortunate that I worked when I did because I got to have that really good access. You
Yeah.
know, I thought covering a baseball team, players and people in the media, you couldn't fake anybody out. Like by the end of a full season, you would really know a guy. Is he a good guy? Is he not a good guy?
Yeah.
What's the deal with this guy? You could give an honest answer, and if you ask the players the same thing about the media, they could give you the same good answer. So, and there were arguments a lot. There was a lot of difficult back and forth, because not every story is a flattering story. And a lot of times the stories were read, if a team was on the road, the story was read by a family member who might not know the context. So you get to the ballpark and be asked about what you wrote. And it was almost a daily thing back and forth for all of the writers. And, I think that's kind of lost now because if there's anybody raises their voice in a locker room, it's a big story the next day about this confrontation. And
Hmm.
it was a confrontational business, but the confrontations allowed you to get close to the people you covered in sort of a backhanded way. And, I lament for people that are younger and are doing it in this more controlled, homogenized world that they don't get to have that same experience.
I know that, you eventually move on to the national scene to cover the league at large, Major League Baseball at large. But during that time when, and maybe even at the Tribune in Chicago, but certainly in Dallas, when you were every day at the ballpark, and you just mentioned getting close to the players, learning about who they are, what makes them go, the different managers. You had quite an array of Rangers managers during the 80s to deal with. And you saw a lot of bad baseball during that time and some good baseball as well. But anything that sticks out with you about guys that you really enjoyed covering during that time, either players or managers, that maybe made your job a little easier to be able to tell the stories that you ended up telling?
Yeah, there's a lot, but the one thing that really sticks would be the Nolan Ryan
Yeah.
years, and being able to cover Nolan, to get to know Nolan, and you kind of see that a guy that is as famous as a baseball player can be, is also a good guy. They're not mutually exclusive because Barry Bonds,
Yeah.
not exactly a pleasure on a daily basis, but Nolan, I always thought, his answers to questions were as good as the questions he was asked. His access, he would go above and beyond, if he saw somebody that was working to get a good story. And I just marvel at him and Ruth and the whole Ryan experience. That was a real treat to get in at the tail end of his career and really see how far a dedicated pro can take his craft.
What about ballparks? You've seen them all now, and you and I went to a lot of Ranger games at the old ballpark at Arlington, and you end up covering them there. Any favorites stick out here from a journalist standpoint, or just to be able to appreciate the beauty of ballparks, and you've seen them all?
Yeah, my favorite was Tiger Stadium of all the old ones.
Yeah.
It wasn't in great shape, but it was in decent shape, and the sight lines were so terrific. It was like the fans and the press were almost right on the field because it was just a big box, and it just kind of built up a big upper deck.
Yeah.
But you weren't far back from the plate or from the bases, and you just felt like it was anything that happened there was so important. And I love Tiger Stadium. It was a place I covered my first World Series, 1984. So maybe I'm a little sentimental and biased by that, but I liked it at the time better than Yankee Stadium, better than Fenway Park, better than Wrigley Field. Now I would say, because I get asked it a lot, I say my
Yeah.
favorite parks are Fenway Park at night and Wrigley in the daytime, because I kind of think that's how they were designed for. And Fenway, like Tiger Stadium, is the heart of the city, and it just sits right there. When the lights are on at Fenway, I think everybody in town is connecting to the Red Sox directly or indirectly, and it just feels so vital. I did not love Arlington Stadium, but there's a lot to look back on and
Yeah.
think that was cool. But when they moved to the ballpark in Arlington, I was like, wow, this is a big time ballpark. And I have been to Globe Life, but I just don't feel the same. I really wish, it wasn't 100 degrees in September, and that, the ballpark in Arlington could have remained viable for the fans, because it was definitely on the short list in my mind
Yeah.
of the best ballparks in baseball. And I really lament the short lifespan it had.
Yeah. Great ballpark. Okay, Chicago. How does the opportunity come along that the Chicago Tribune, you end up going there?
Well, I was very happy in Dallas, and I would
Yeah.
have probably told you this is where I'm going to work the rest of my life. But my wife is from the Midwest, and there are two ballparks in Chicago. So by that time, I was definitely a baseball reporter, and I liked the opportunity to go report on baseball in a two-team town. A legendary reporter, Jerome Holtzman, was very close to retiring from the Chicago Tribune. And so part of the pitch for that job was, you'll cover a team for a while, but then we'll need a national guy when Jerome retires, and you'll be you are the guy we have in mind. So it was very attractive career-wise, and it was a good family move. I always looked back at Dallas Fort Worth and thought, what if I hadn't moved? What if I had stayed home? But Chicago, that's when I look back at my career, I definitely challenged myself going to these cities, small cities early, big cities later, where there were some difficult transitions, and moving into Chicago is tough for anybody because it's a very homegrown provincial city, I feel. And it wasn't always the easiest, but I was right about the two-team concept because I wasn't tied to, usually one of the two teams, the Cubs or the White Sox, would be having a very interesting year. I was fortunate I was working when both of those teams ended long World Series droughts. And just the storylines and the people were fascinating. And Chicago was it was a great city. In the summer, it's as good of a city as there is in the country. Really lament the questions now about crime in Chicago. It was a beautiful place, and I raised kids, lived in the suburbs, and after the kids were grown, moved into the city itself. And I had a terrific time living there, and the opportunity working at the Chicago Tribune, covering baseball in a two-team market, I was really lucky.
Okay, so talk about, I'm going to come back to a little bit about, you mentioned the difficulties and struggles when you move from job to job or different things when you have families involved and career. But then the opportunity to cover the league as a whole, MLB.com and some other things. So how did that come about, and how difficult was that was it difficult to make that move?
No, it was for kind of the old classic beat writer job. Is probably best done by a single man because at some points in time I was traveling 150 to 175 days a year.
Wow,
and that's too many.
That's tough.
And being a national writer with the ability to travel for a few days at a time, not a 10-day road trip. Really helped in being around my family. And, I was lucky that in the era I did it, both in Dallas, I did some national reporting. And then in Chicago, I worked for papers that had the budget. When I was a national guy in '98 when the Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire home run race.
Oh, wow.
Happened. And our beat guys covered the Sosa side of it for the most part. I would pop out there and add columns to our coverage sometimes, when I wasn't traveling. But I think I saw McGwire's last 13 home runs out of his 70. Somehow I wasn't there every game, but he never homered if I wasn't there. And so I saw his last 13.
You were his good luck charm.
I had the line that, which was sadly probably true, that summer I saw more of Roger Maris's children who were traveling to be there when the record was broken than I did my own children.
Exactly.
But it was, there were great stories to tell. And, one thing I covered a lot of, and the Chicago Tribune cared a lot about, and the Dallas Morning News too before it, were all the labor issues in baseball, which really until 2002 or so, you never knew if the game was going to shut down like it did in '94 and '95 over labor issues. So those were kind of unexpected things to cover, but they would be fascinating to get in there and talk to the negotiators and the owners and the players who were on the Players Association board, and those were, and we used to call him the great baseball writer for the New York Times who really specialized in labor, Murray Chass. We
Yeah.
would call these rounds of negotiation because they happen about every 4 years. We would refer to them as the Murray Chass Olympics. It was it wasn't exactly what I thought I'd be covering when I signed up, but you really got to see the behind the scenes part of baseball, and how they made the meat, and it was really interesting.
Well, did you take that as a, I mean, knowing you like I do and your craft of being a writer, did you take that on as like, wow, here's a new challenge, maybe not totally new, but a different thing that I've been doing for a long time, and challenges, you as a sports journalist and as just a writer, a creator, to be able to approach a topic or a sport, certainly, that you covered a long time, but from a much different perspective and bring something new out in you as a journalist?
Well, probably not that directly. It was just something that was needed. And
Yeah.
you go back to, and you got to know the commissioners, which was interesting. Go back to when Peter Ueberroth was in charge, and ultimately Ueberroth and his group put together the George W. Bush, Rusty Rose group that took over the Rangers when they were very close to leaving town. I think, had they not been able to find, a good qualified ownership group there, they were very close to being purchased by a group that was going to move them to Tampa, Florida.
Yeah.
And so that kind of stuff, the business side of it, while it's not what anybody wants to read about, 24/7, certainly is super significant. And one of the benefits for me personally was throughout all that, Bud Selig, the Milwaukee Brewers owner for most of that time, was directly involved, and very easy guy to get to know. And I developed a really good relationship with Bud through the years. Started in Dallas when the Rangers, he would come into the press box, which very few owners ever did. Every
Yeah.
game, he was at the games, and he would come in and visit the baseball writers in the press box, and just throw out a barb to one of the Milwaukee writers or something. And it was definitely different. And it was hard not. He was a guy who was hard not to get to know.
Well, let me ask you about your relationship with him. You said you got to know him and it was easy to be around Bud Selig, and then you end up kind of collaborating with him and co-authoring a book. How did that come about? And talk a little bit about the book itself and what you'd hope to accomplish with it.
Yeah, it was. He talked for probably his last 10 years as commissioner that he's a historian himself.
Yeah.
He teaches history of sports classes. He still teaches them, both at Arizona State and at University of Wisconsin. He still travels back and forth to do that. And so it was very important to him to have a good history of his time as commissioner. And so when he finally did step back, it kind of landed in my lap at a time when I needed something to do because I was restructured out of my
Yes.
job
I like that.
with MLB.com, where I would have thought I would have worked till I was age 70. And it turned out 61, I think, was as far as I got. So, I kind of needed something that would keep me occupied.
Yeah.
And he had started down the project of the road of writing the book, but it was not producing what he wanted out of it or what the publisher wanted out of it. So I was sort of a pinch hitter on the project was when I got involved. But it was I'm really proud of the book. It's called For the Good of the Game, although my title would have been Inside Job since he was an owner who was made commissioner. But Bud opted for the good of the game, and it's really, I think, because he was involved in so much going back to the 60s when the Braves moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta. That's when he got involved. He was in his 20s and he got involved in trying to get a Milwaukee, another baseball team. And so, I mean, we were able to cover 60 years of baseball history, probably, from his perspective with his insider knowledge of a lot of things. And, you know, for me personally, I was living in Chicago, and I would ride the Amtrak back and forth from Chicago to Milwaukee, and we'd sit in his office, and I don't know how many hours of tape we did, but it was a lot. And we went over some topics probably 5 times.
Yeah.
And he never got impatient. And every time you revisited a pretty good anecdote, it became a good anecdote. And, you know, I really enjoyed doing that project. And, you know, the book was on the New York Times bestseller list,
Right.
which I think both of us are proud of. And, you know, I think he was a guy who'd lived a life that produced a story worth telling. And I think I helped him tell it well.
Yeah. For the good of the game. And what do you think, when you got to know him as well as you did, Phil, what do you think made him as effective that as he was, both as an owner and from the commissioner's office and league-wide, that made him successful and be able to accomplish what he was able to accomplish in what we know is it can be a difficult labor market when you're talking about baseball labor and competitively from the league side?
You know, I think, you know, when he was chairman of the executive council, which is the most powerful group of owners. And then when they reached out and fired Faye Vincent, it was after that he became for 3 years, it was kind of like interim commissioner, and then they took it away and he was a full-time commissioner. And a lot of people raised their eyebrows that this owner would want to be commissioner. But that totally overlooks the fact that the owners always hired the commissioner. So baseball would have these short-term commissioners that, in my opinion, Peter Uberoff being an example, would get involved in the sport because it would help his own career, but he wasn't really dedicated to the sport. And meanwhile, the players union had Marvin Miller at first, and then Donald Fear, who were brilliant, dogged labor lawyers. And they would be there from one labor negotiation to the next, to the next, and the next. And the owners just kept switching their voices in those talks. And the players just pounded them in all those negotiations. And for some reason, it made sense to me that the owners hire one of their own who has a vested interest in growing the sport, you know, preserving the best competitive balance they can have in the sport. You know, and also treating players well. You know, Bud is a, you know, while he's definitely on the side of management, he's also a guy that has relationships with a lot of players. Back to Henry Aaron would be the best example, but Robin Yount, you know, the players that came through Milwaukee. Now Craig Counsell, the Cubs manager, left the Brewers to join the Cubs. I'm not sure what Bud thought about him leaving the Brewers to join the Cubs. But, you know, he could call Craig Counsell, and Craig wouldn't be surprised that Bud was on the phone because he has those kind of relationships. And, you know, baseball needed that, in my opinion. But a lot of people, maybe the New York people, because it had always been sort of based, New York offices sort of ran baseball. And here was a guy, the Milwaukee Brewers owner, he was going to have his own commissioner's office in Milwaukee. He wasn't going to go to New York. A lot of people sort of took Bud lightly or saw conspiracies where there really weren't any, rather than just realize here's a guy that at that time knew baseball had some serious issues and needed somebody that would have some staying power to work through those. And, you know, to my mind, that was Bud was a good choice. And to say it was wrong to have an owner be the commissioner overlooks the way the structure of pro sports. It's same in every pro sports. The owners hire the commissioner. So when the commissioner stops being popular with the owners, he's no longer the commissioner.
That's right. Okay, so you have that book. You've written some other books. What's inspiring you now? What's motivating you now for the next project or to creatively? Is there more? Are there more books in the future you think working on?
Well, I'm kind of spoiled, so it would have to be a good project that kind of landed in my lap the way the Selig. I do love the
Yeah.
process of writing, but the process of um, like even the Selig book
Hmm.
was a nightmare for me to get a contract at the end of the day with and to be valued for my time. So I
Yeah.
think for writers, it's still a huge challenge, unless you're a John Grisham or somebody with, a multi book deal. It's still really hard to get the publishers you want to write for to, buy into your ideas with
Yeah.
enthusiasm and a nice advance because you know when I was younger I would think I wrote a Texas Rangers book in the late
Yeah.
80s. The
Yeah.
Impossible takes a little longer, and at that point I'm excited by if it sells X number of copies I could make this much money, but
Yeah.
along the way I learned the advance is what you have. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to jump into any projects because they do take over your life. I mean, it's hard to write a book. So, I have to know up front what the deal is. So for that reason, I have pursued one or two um, since then. I had a nice deal with a businessman to write his memoir, and somehow during COVID and all that, he kind of backed out of his interest. But it was
Mm.
going to be maybe more of a family history, but he approached it the right way until he just kind of backed out of it.
Yeah.
And since then, I've done other things. But the one project that's kind of a passion project is I've written a screenplay with a partner who is a screenwriter, uh, Brady Morrell, and we took the Texas Rangers 1994 replacement team, or 95,
Yeah.
went out of that strike. The Rangers were really the only team in baseball that tried to win with replacement players. They had a great front office with Doug Melvin and Omar Minaya, who was young and aggressive. They went to the Mexican League and got the best Mexican League players. They got like batting champions from Italy. They weren't just using truck drivers, which is sort of
Yeah.
the people think back to replacement guys. That's what they think of.
Hmm.
And they really put together a great team. And I've carried around the daily press clippings that we were in Florida. Yes, we were in 94. Trying to think if the Rangers were still in Florida or Arizona. But I think they were still in Florida.
Yeah.
And so we get the press clippings every day from John Blake, who was the Rangers PR guy, what everybody wrote. And I still have all of those in my office because something
Wow.
struck me then that there's something about this. And I never really thought it was a documentary, although it could have been, and I never really thought it was a book. But my collaborator, Brady, sort of had the idea to make it. I think it could be a Ted Lasso of baseball
Yeah.
if we could find somebody who wanted to make it with us. So it's wandering around somewhere in Los Angeles in drawers and studios, and it's been a finished product, or it's been a good enough to present product for a couple years, and we just need to excite the right producer, actor, actress who's
Yeah.
looking for a vehicle. And I think viewers are due a really good baseball series.
Yeah.
It's been a long time, so that's sort of my passion project. But whether it's made or not, I felt really good, getting the pilot written and the treatment written, and it kind of got it out of my system. But I think it could be a great show.
You talked about that you love writing. And I mean, I could tell from when our early childhood that you were born to be a writer. But now that you've come, X number of years into all your career and talking about the screenplay and books, how different for you was that, I guess, mentally or creatively when you had to put on your writing hat, so to speak? How different is it approaching writing a book or a screenplay as opposed to being, a beat writer or a journalist that's covering sports?
Well, being a baseball writer was a really, really good training. And I should also say, I still write for Forbes.
Yeah.
So I publish, it's mostly Chicago sports related, the Bears and the baseball teams. But what as a beat writer, I was writing thousands of words a day, maybe 1,500 to 2,500 words just on any given day with two versions of a game story and notes. And so it kind of allowed me to write. I think to have a book, I think a regular book, you kind of need to have 75,000 to 80,000 words minimum. And that sounds really daunting. And when I wrote a book on the 2005 White Sox after the White Sox won the World Series called Say It So. And the idea was really to have it out at Christmas, which the publisher missed that target. But I was trying to write, as soon as the World Series was over, a book that tells an 80 to 100,000 word story of that book. And the way I made it possible in my own mind was I said, if I write a Sunday notes column, that's 1,500 words or 1,000 words. So it's just like I got to write 7 Sunday notes columns this week. But you want it to be good, so you don't want to just sit down and tap the keyboard until you can't tap anymore. But I found for myself, the earlier I got up in the morning, the more productive a day could be. I don't know if that was just through the years, but 5 a.m. till 8 or 9 a.m. And I think some of those I still had kids in the house, and the house was quiet. But I think a lot of writers are the same, that you just have to get the discipline to be able to get up and sit down and get started and then just stay at it. And, if you've done the reporting, if you haven't done the reporting, you're sunk, unless you're a lot more creative than me and you can just make up a novel as you go. I'm a huge reader. I love reading those novels, but to be constantly developing the storyline and the characters, that's a different kind of writing.
What do you like to pass along or share? And you may have had plenty of opportunities to do this to young writers that are going through college like you did many years ago, that want to follow in a footstep that was similar to yours. What key components do you share with journalists to be? And you kind of touched on one that, maybe be a reporter first, then be a writer, and you can discover a lot of things that way. But what do you like to share as the cornerstones for someone that would kind of like to follow your footsteps?
Well, as you know, Brian, it's difficult for people of our generation because the platforms have changed so much.
Right.
And there's so much to do with videos and the side of the business that honestly I never really dug in on. So I think that limits me. But I think there are some truths. And, the main thing I say is, like, to a college student, never say no to an opportunity. If you have a chance to do play-by-play on college volleyball and you want to say, well, I've never done volleyball. Well, you can do it. You just have to fake it till you make it. Learn it, learn on the job. And I think it is all about getting as much experience as you can get when you're young as you can be. Because you find out what fits you, what doesn't fit you, and you make connections. There's a lot still about networking, and you've got to make a lot of cold calls before you know how to do it. And sometimes you have to just be a really good listener. Like, you call somebody and ask them a question, and this is hard for me at my age, it's still hard, is to let somebody answer your question rather than just, get halfway in, your mind switches to something else. And so I would say yes, don't say no to chances. And then I would say be a good listener and, pick examples and get to know those people and don't be afraid to ask for advice. There are no dumb questions.
You talked about earlier, Phil, that sometimes the different job changes, and you were certainly a great example of never saying no to something. I mean, you jump out and take that Shreveport job, and then Albuquerque and Florida, and then back home. As difficult as it might be, those challenges or those hurdles of changing markets and families, difficult strains, but adjusting to new areas, like going to Chicago, did all those hurdles and things just basically help mold you to be the kind of the person you've become, and certainly the professional writer that you've become through your career?
Yeah, without question. And it wasn't like it was hard to do at the time, really. But I can remember the first 10 years I went to New York City covering the Rangers or another sports story. I didn't like New York City. It was hard, and it was scary on the subway. And But at some point, there was a tipping point, and it's like you realize, you realize you can do it, and you appreciate the beauty of other places. I can remember when I moved from Dallas to Chicago, I quickly, these Midwestern accents and people, they're not like me. And the first week I was there, I was going to call Dave Smith and ask if I could come home to the morning news. But at some point I realized, I don't have to change because I'm working someplace else. I can still be me. And, I can still listen to Robert Earl Keen music. I don't have to start playing Buddy Guy in my car, and that's pretty simple, but it's easy to, you want to stay as authentic, true to yourself as you can. And sometimes there is a temptation to try to act different than you are because of where you're living. But I don't know there's a place in the world, and there probably is, but where you could drop me tomorrow and I wouldn't, language would be a problem. I regret not doing a better job. And that's something I would tell a young person is invest some time in learning a useful language. In Texas, it would be Spanish.
Yep.
Other places, it could be French, German. It could be an Asian, depending on what you're doing. But I feel like language is really, really important. And I studied Spanish at North Texas, but I really didn't learn to speak, which was to my own detriment. And, so if you drop me someplace, language might be a problem, but I wouldn't be freaking out because of, people look different than me. I look different than them. I've kind of learned from being in a lot of situations and a lot of places, people are people, and 99.5% of them are really nice, good people, whether they look like you or not.
Well, Phil, from our classmate years all the way up to now, fascinating to follow your career and our friendship along the way. Some great accomplishments, and I look forward to, hopefully there's another book in you or another project coming along soon. I look forward to seeing that, but thanks for being on the show. Well,
and maybe we'll get together at a Mean Green game before too long.
Let's do that. Go Mean Green. Thanks, Phil.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of Built for This. Be sure to follow Built for This on your favorite listening platform and share it with a friend. Join me on the next episode when I will share entertaining stories of inspiration, encouragement, and purpose-driven experiences. What are you built for? Built for This is produced and recorded by Heart Media DFW.